I agree with you that defenses are difficult to project, especially at this point. They could be better, in which case, great. my bet has even more value. My point is that I'm not relying on their defense taking a massive step forward here. It would be great if they do, and I think there's multiple ways to win this bet. Even if their defense doesn't take a massive step forward, I think they have a chance by virtue of the way their offense runs.
Welcome to another episode of the Football Analytics Show. My name is Ed Fang, your host. And on this episode, I'm thrilled to have SharpClarke on the show. He is an NFL originator. And in this episode, he talks about the unique blend of both subjective and objective that he uses to bet NFL spreads. This includes how he builds his model. He also gives us a week one bet. And we also talk about model building and the insights from a recent academic paper. The Football Analytics Show is brought to you by the Power Ranks Sports Betting Newsletter. This is a free service that strives to be three things. 1, valuable. 2, concise. 3, entertaining. Every Saturday, I send out my curated list of sports betting tips and analytics in 5 Nugget Saturday. As we get towards the football season, I will be sending you some preview newsletters to get you ready for the season. To sign up for this free service, go to thepowerrank.com. That is my site for better sports betting tips through data and analytics. Once again, that's thepowerrank.com. Joining me on this episode of the Football Analytics Show is SharpClarke. He is an NFL originator, and I've gotten interested in his work from all the great insights he's been posting on Twitter and on his pod. SharpClarke, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ed. I've been excited about this for basically all week since you asked me.
Awesome. That sounds good. I'm really excited about it too. Part of that excitement is because I don't really know much about you or your background or your story. How did you get into thinking deeply about the NFL and betting NFL spreads?
I was a longtime NFL fan, playing fantasy football and betting casually since I was in college, so about nearly 20 years ago now. And I have a hyper competitive, aspect to my personality. So I was trying to find every edge that I possibly could. And it's like a challenge for me, right? But I was never any good. I never really took it that seriously. I remember coming up with this amazing realization in 2009 that passing efficiency correlated with winning and running efficiency did not. So I made this Excel spreadsheet where I just had each team's offensive and defensive net yards per pass play, and basically just bet on the teams that had the passing advantage. And surprise, surprise, my naive model was about 50-50 on the year because it had no real edge. But around 2019, I started to get a bit more serious about the betting side. And I started to notice that oftentimes there's a difference between the way teams are talked about and the way game results are talked about and statistics and the way that I actually saw it happen on the field. And so I started to think more systematically about how I might be able to capture those differences. And then COVID hit in 2020, and I had all this time in my hands. I had taught myself how to use Python. So I wrote all these programs and came up with this analytical framework for analyzing every single NFL game, watching it, and then turning that into numbers that I can then use to try to capture that delta between what I saw on the field and the way teams ended up statistically or perceptually. And that kind of led to my system that I've been using since 2020.
Wow, that's awesome. So would it be fair to say that everything kind of starts with watching every snap, and then you turn that into some metrics and data in which you then turn into a prediction? Is that kind of how your process works in general?
Yeah, exactly. So the numbers that I'm looking for are, like statistics will treat events that happen in the game as concrete outcomes, right? Like this play gained this many yards. This was a positive. This was a successful play, based on the success rate metric or whatever. Whereas, in reality, every single play is a confluence of a million things happening at the same time. And these events are actually probabilistic, right? Just in the same way that we think of game results as probabilistic, individual plays are probabilistic. And that's kind of the foundation of my analytical system that I use. And yes, I watch every snap. I'm grading it. I'm also trying to understand situationally who teams are, to understand, archetypes basically that we can use to project performance forward in different types of situations.
Right, for sure. And then would on the back end, like the coding aspect of it, give me a sense for kind of like what goes on there and maybe how you use your background to do that.
Yeah, so the coding aspect is turning those numbers into like a prediction model, right? So, unlike models that use back-tested data that you can access, through databases, I've created every input myself. So it's taken me several years to actually build a betting model because I haven't had enough data points. This is the first year where I have a full-blown, here's what my model spits out for this game. I have an overlay of situational factors that, skew those numbers a little bit. And it's just based on how teams in the past with certain archetypes and certain ranges of outcomes on offense and defense have performed in a variety of different games, right? So the more data points I have, the more accurate the model becomes theoretically. And that's mostly what I'm using my thing for, is storing data and then using that data to predict outcomes.
Fascinating. All right, so maybe it'll become a little bit more clear as we talk about kind of the differences between preseason and during the season. Give me a sense for how you approach the NFL season right now. We're recording this in late July. We don't have any data on the current season. A lot of the work kind of shows that things tend to regress a lot from season to season. So how do you think about the NFL now?
Yeah, I actually last year I went really deep into every team. I actually built a simulation model that simulated the season a million times using ranges of outcomes for offense and defense. And then even, it was so nuanced, it even included, potential motivational factors in week 18, right? If certain teams had nothing to play for, it would impact the win percentage of that game. And all of that it was fun. It was a fun academic exercise, but it didn't really help me that much because so much changes year to year in the NFL. Every team is this complex system, and parts move around. Coaches change, players change. Even without players changing, things change. And so our preseason predictions are usually pretty worthless by like week 4, if not earlier. So this year I'm taking kind of a step back. I don't have as much futures exposure, even though I made a profit on my futures last year. I found that it was impacting my early season perception of the teams and my betting performance early in the year. So I'm taking a much more fluid approach this year, where I have all these opinions on these teams and I try to understand them, but I'm going to be very quick to adjust my opinions early in the year.
Interesting. And that's from, right, obviously watching every snap and, right?
Yeah. Yep. So I'm watching every snap, and then I try to conceptualize using my numbers, right? Another thing that I use my Python programming for is I create these charts that show, what I would have projected, what my numbers projected for a team's performance, and then how that team actually performed after observing the game. And it shows that over the course of the season. And so I can kind of identify situations where a team outperformed or underperformed its expectation. And that can lead me to conclusions about, okay, hey, look, this team was below expectation against every team that had a really solid kind of up the gut run defense, right? Does that make sense with who I know this team to be? And then I kind of analyze it from there, and that might help me understand, why this team is successful versus unsuccessful in any given week.
Right, for sure. So maybe we can talk a little bit. So we're in the season, you're watching every snap. I certainly don't want you to give away anything that you don't want to share publicly, but maybe if you could give a sense for how that translates into what kind of metrics then that eventually go into your model.
Yeah, my model is unique in that every single input is my own metric, right? Nobody else is using these numbers because I'm creating them myself each week as I go. And it usually takes until, so I watch NFL Game Pass, and it usually takes until Wednesday or Thursday for me to watch and grade every single game. Sometimes I'll make a bet earlier in the week if I've watched the teams that are playing in that game already. But mostly it's Wednesday or Thursday that things kind of crystallize for me. And those metrics update, my archetypes for the teams, my numbers for the teams, and then I just run simulations for, the next week's outcomes. And then I have a kind of a secondary layer that I put on top of that that's built around, I don't want to go into too much detail, but it's built around kind of understanding potential situations where, like, variance happens in a game, right? And so early on, there's always a chance that, something surprising happens, a team goes up 7-0, 10-0, whatever. And how teams respond in those types of situations is not uniformly correlated to how good the team is. There are aspects of team performance that are more predictive than others, right? So that's the second layer that I put over it, is I compare the spread to the archetype to determine whether or not the numbers projection should trigger a bet or not.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess, what interests me about this, right, is you're watching every game and you have these proprietary metrics, which is pretty cool because other people like me are just lazy and we rely on our code to dig through the play-by-play and look at metrics that are competitive. So I presume this is, the watching of the plays is where you feel like you get your edge.
Absolutely. And honestly, so I came up with the concept for what I'm doing between the 2019 and 2020 season. But each offseason since then, I have improved and honed my methodology, right? Because each offseason gives me a chance to sit back and reflect on, what am I not capturing? Are there biases in my model? How can I improve it? And so I've been tweaking it each year based on experience. And, the more you watch games and the more you try to evaluate what's happening in this way, the better you get at it. It's not something that you can do right off the bat. And so I think each year I become a little bit more sophisticated at identifying the things that lead to success in the future based on what happens on the field. And yeah, that is basically, even if I did give away exactly what I do, like the amount of time it would take someone to do it and then also like become better at it over time, like still would take a lot of effort. So it's not it's not like I have this, this secret sauce that if I say it out loud, my edge disappears. It's one that requires constant work and improvement.
Absolutely. So when you let's maybe compare and contrast, right? Like you said, in 2023, you have this model, it's going to spit out a number at you. I guess let's start with this season. Do you anticipate that you're going to be betting mostly on that model, or is it going to be like a lot of more subjective analysis that you're going to put into making that final decision on an NFL spread?
I'm definitely going to lean on the model this year. Last year, I had kind of a prototype of the model that wasn't as good, and I didn't have a lot of faith in it. So I ended up just, basically betting subjectively. The model was kind of a guide. And after the season ended, I went back and, I study every bet I make, the reasons why I made it at the time. I have a spreadsheet that tracks all this stuff. And I realized that my subjective, moving away from the model, not betting where it should have, or betting where it didn't say I had quite enough edge, I actually performed very poorly on those games. And if I had just followed the model, I would have been much more successful. So one, I've improved the model based on another year's worth of data, and two, I'm going to follow it much more strictly this year. So that's definitely going to be my approach.
How did that contrast to when you first started betting? What, like 2019, I think it was?
Yeah, but I've started betting seriously. Yeah, it's very different, right? Because I didn't have a model. It was much more subjective. It was like, oh, hey, I watched this game and, the final score was 30-17 and everyone's talking about how, this quarterback is washed. And, I watched the game and it was actually like, he threw a pretty good ball and it got tipped and intercepted, returned for a touchdown. And then the next drive, the running back fumbled on the first play and the other team had a short field. And it's like, this isn't really predictive of what's going to happen in the future. So, I'm kind of more optimistic on this team. It was much more subjective, much more rough. And then that turned into the concept for making it analytical and concrete.
Right. So back when you were first doing this, like, would you just kind of eyeball not eyeball, but would you like kind of come up with a number in your head based on what you had watched? Like before you looked at the markets, after you looked at the markets?
Yeah, it's a great question. Initially, I didn't have any like, this is what I predict the outcome to be. Everything was relative to the market, right? So I began with the assumption that the market is generally efficient in terms of capturing, the available data and making predictions. So if you start from that premise, then any potential bias in that data, what I call bias is sort of like overweighting outcomes versus process. Any kind of bias can be exploited by just saying, well, the market price is wrong in this direction, and so I'm just going to bet the other side. Like, it was a very, very rudimentary process, not very sophisticated. it was actually very successful, at least in the short term. But I think that might have just been luck and just sort of being directionally accurate more often than not, more so than any kind of like, this is an accurate prediction model.
Right. So the market, do you feel like, what do you think are the kind of the primary drivers of the market? I mean, I presume it's not like these talking heads that you've discussed so far, right? It's more pro bettors, and actually a decent number of them are giving their opinions on public forums and podcasts and so forth. And then presumably, well, actually, I don't want to answer the question for you. What do you think is actually driving the NFL spreads?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it changes throughout the week, right? But this goes to my goal, right? My goal is eventually to have a betting system, betting model that wins against late week NFL spreads, right? So when I'm talking about the market from here on out, I'm going to be talking about late week market, right? I think the early week market is a bit different. So I think the market is driven by obviously the most successful and influential bettors, the ones that are winning long-term, betting large amounts. And I think that those bettors are typically using models that are based on statistics, right? Play-by-play data analyzed in really sophisticated ways. Maybe machine learning models to, backtest different theories, things like that. I also think they use player-level evaluations to analyze the impact of absences, trades, injuries, etc. And those can be based on anything from PFF grades or Madden ratings, whatever combination of things, position weighted value based on prior production, with and without that player, et cetera. I think those types of things are, everyone has their own model. Every one of these betting groups has their own way of betting it, but they're all fundamentally built on results-based analysis of NFL games. And so that's what I think shapes the market ultimately.
Right. But you also mean probably like results based in the NFL, kind of in the sense that I was talking about earlier, right? Like kind of data driven analysis of the play by play, and not necessarily the layer that you're adding on, which is watching every snap, coming up with your own metrics, so on and so forth, right?
Exactly, right. So, theoretically, you could run a machine learning model through every play of NFL history. Raises all kinds of questions about how relevant
Exactly.
that is in 1960, right? But theoretically, you could identify the types of statistics that are predictive, right? Maybe success rate is more predictive than EPA per play. By weight, this much weight, or DVOA counts for this much, or whatever backtesting model you have, you're using, like very complex data sets, but you're using it without looking at the context for every individual play. And that's going to create some bias within the market towards the types of things that have happened to lead to good results in the past, which may not necessarily be predictive of future success exactly.
Right. PFF is supposed to consider that context, right? When they assign these grades, they're assigning a grade for every single player based on two evaluators that watch every play. Do you find that useful? Do you think they do a good job with that? And is it similar to what you're doing?
It's a good question. They're evaluating player by player performance, and I'm evaluating holistic team performance, which I think is a bit different. I don't have an opinion on their process because I don't know their process, but I know that it has led to some very poor judgments in some cases, like, Mahomes being the 10th ranked quarterback or whatever. To me, it is like fairly obvious that that's just not the case. So I do question some of their methodology, but it's a little different than what I do in terms of player level evaluations versus team level evaluations. I'm more focused on the entire system rather than individual players.
What year did they have Mahomes 10th? Was that like 2021?
I can't remember the exact year. I guess 2021 was his worst year. Yeah.
I mean, that was an interesting season just because, I did see that. And actually, I thought watching him play, I thought I saw him make more poor plays than any other season. But and that was the year I feel like there was all this talk about playing like two high safeties and taking those deep balls to Tyreek Hill out. But a lot of the passing success rate stuff were still pretty spectacular for Kansas City that year. Obviously, didn't quite get it done in the playoffs, but Yeah, that was an interesting year where PFF really did have them pretty low.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of, it's hard to evaluate quarterback play holistically. Like there's just so many different aspects of it. But obviously the PFF model, which rates Joe Burrow super high every year, doesn't quite give enough weight to, taking sacks. Whereas, and probably overweights playing within structure and playing within the reads, because Burrow does that really well. But Mahomes is much more creative and, kind of off the play sheet. So I don't know if they're going to adjust their model over time, but that's something that I will look for every offseason is like, what am I not capturing correctly and how can I adjust it?
Right. Yeah. I don't know what they do. I think there's been a lot of turnover there. So, I mean, I still mostly use that for stuff that doesn't have other numbers. So I tend to use it a lot for like coverage grades and things like that. And then they have a lot of good data on not pass rush win rates, but like pressure rates and stuff like that for like pass rushers. I mean, I guess I look at the quarterback stuff too, because if it's going to drastically differ from what I'm either seeing or what some of my metrics do, I'll resort to that as well. I can't really think of a good model.
Sorry, I use quarterback because easy, low hanging fruit. But as a way to illustrate why I don't necessarily trust all the numbers, I do think it's useful, right? In sort of an aggregate sense, like it's going to be directionally accurate in most cases. But it also is just fundamentally different from how I think about teams, right? So performance is it depends so much on the pieces around you and the scheme that you're in. And so like one thing that player level evaluations can lead to is overvaluing or undervaluing certain players, right? So when you've got, for example, a quarterback like Justin Fields or Lamar Jackson who can, really escape pressure and get outside the pocket, the offensive line's job is so much easier, right? You don't have to do as much. You're not asked to do as much versus like Tom Brady last year was a statue in the pocket. And so the run blocking was worse, the pass blocking was worse. And people say, well, the offensive line was terrible. Look at the grades. And, miraculously, every time a quarterback with true mobility joins a team, the offensive line improves. Every single time. And it's just because their job is getting easier. And I think sometimes player level grades don't account for those nuances. And so I'm just not even factoring those into my model and hoping that the inaccuracies that influence the market don't influence my model.
That's interesting. I mean, I actually found that the pass blocking grades for offensive linemen were pretty sticky from year to year, like more so than their pressure allowed rates. Because the one thing I would push back on is that, Brady might be a statue, but he also gets rid of the ball, right? And so that helps like an offensive lineman's sack numbers. And, we know like pressure rate, sack rates is a quarterback stat, right? So how does that kind of figure into your analysis?
Right. I mean, I don't think anyone really serious betting uses sack numbers. So I think, it can definitely impact, like summary statistics, but the actual player level grades, I look at like ESPN, pass rush win rate and run block win rate, and PFF grades for offensive linemen, as a whole, like this team's offensive line was ranked this or whatever. And I had a tweet about this. I don't have the data on me right now. I wish I did, but it was like showing, the Cardinals offensive line the year before Murray, and then Murray's first year and Murray's second year, and then Lamar Jackson in Baltimore, the offensive line grades the year before Lamar, and then Lamar's year and the year after, and then Philadelphia with Jalen Hurts and Chicago with Justin Fields most recently. In every instance, the grades improved by about 10 spots on average the year that mobile quarterback entered the offense. So I don't know about the specific sack numbers, and there may be other context for that. Maybe they actually improved the offensive line, but I just don't think that it's a coincidence that when a job is easier to do, you're going to get a higher grade at it.
Right, for sure. And I presume that you're specifically focusing in on the pass blocking grades, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so SharpClarke, let's maybe get into some bets. Is there an NFL bet that you would be willing to share with us this preseason?
Sure, yeah. A lot of my futures bets have moved so dramatically that it's pointless to talk about them now. So I'm actually going to talk about a week one bet that is still on the board. I like the Lions +7 in week one at Kansas City on opening night. That's still available -110 across the board. The reasoning is not because I think the Chiefs are overrated. They're the best team in the NFL. They should be favorites to win the Super Bowl. I love Mahomes. I'm actually a Chiefs fan. But the thing about it is most people, at least early betting models, right? Like the larger bettors haven't spoken yet. They're built around, basic assumptions of team quality and then comparing the team quality to create a projected spread. You factor in home field, you factor in, maybe some specific matchup things, whatever. And I think the gap in a vacuum between the Chiefs and the Lions is at least 7 points when you give the Chiefs home field. But I don't think that it accurately accounts for who the Chiefs are, particularly because the Chiefs' offense is so good that it negates the impact of a good defense, right? Like last year, the Chiefs played 9 games against top 10 defenses, and they averaged 30.9 points in those games, or 8 games, sorry. Mm. They played 5 games against bottom 10 defenses and averaged 30.2 points in those games. So they actually averaged more points per game against the better defenses they faced, because Patrick Mahomes is so good that he negates all the things that a defense does. And so when you play a team like the Lions, whose weakness is entirely on the defensive side of the ball, it's like, how much better can the Chiefs offense be against a bad defense? It's just, there's a cap there. So I just don't think that the numerical difference between the teams is really appropriately captured by the spread. And I think there are much more outcomes where the Lions make this a close game by virtue of their offense than the Chiefs blow them out.
Very interesting. There's lots to unpack here. The Lions made a bunch of improvements to their secondary. It looks like they're kind of leaning on a couple of young, promising pass rushers as well. Defense is always difficult to predict than offense, especially right now at this point in the season. So you seem to suggest that you're not really buying into too many improvements for the Lions on the defensive side of the ball, especially defending the pass.
I agree with you that defenses are difficult to project, especially at this point. They could be better, in which case, great. my bet has even more value. My point is that I'm not relying on their defense taking a massive step forward here. It would be great if they do, and I think there's multiple ways to win this bet. Even if their defense doesn't take a massive step forward, I think they have a chance by virtue of the way their offense runs.
Right, and so it's also showing faith in the Lions' offense. And honestly, this is something that I don't have complete faith in. We've seen the good Jared Goff, which was obviously the last part of last season, and actually, honestly, for most of last season. And we've seen the not so good Jared Goff as well, meaning the last year with the Rams, where he got shipped off after the end of the season. There's been a lot of talk about how great offensive coordinator Ben Johnson is, and the synergies there. I certainly believe that Amon-Ra St. Brown is an incredible weapon at wide receiver. I guess I'm just not convinced that this offense is going to be as good as they were last year. They were a top 5 offense in a lot of the ways that I looked at it. I can certainly see them slipping out of that, maybe even out of the top 10. Talk me out of that.
Yeah, so a couple things. They finished the season really, really strong, right? They were 8-2 down the stretch with one loss. One of those 2 losses was against Buffalo on a last-second field goal. Their offense performed really well down the stretch. And I think in Ben Johnson's first year as offensive coordinator, he really learned as he went. He started implementing things as the season went on. And what stuck out to me in particular was each of the times that Detroit played the same team twice, so their divisional opponents, the offense performed at a higher level in the second game. Whereas a lot of times you see the opposite, right? Where the defense kind of figures out what the offense is doing and they kind of clamp down on it. The Lions, Ben Johnson thinks in terms of, what is this defense doing to stop us, and how can we use that against itself? How can we set up successful plays, explosive plays by, running the same formations and then changing what we do out of it? How can I use the defensive tendencies to create mismatches where I've got, Khalif Raymond lined up in the slot against a defensive end, right? He has his type of mind is similar to Kyle Shanahan in this creativity way. So I think that's something that builds and grows over time. And so I anticipate more of a continued plateau of good performance. And then the other thing is, early in the season, they suffered some key injuries, right? Amon-Ra St. Brown missed some games, and DeAndre Swift did as well. And while skill players don't always have a massive impact on the outcome, in this particular offense that relied on the versatility of those 2 players in particular, I think it really did matter. And now they've had Jahmyr Gibbs and they've had Sam Laporta, both of whom are versatile players that can move around, in the backfield, slot, wide, etc. So I think Ben Johnson has all the pieces that he wants and can really take this offense to another step forward in this year.
Interesting. So you're not upset that they took Jahmyr Gibbs so high in the first round?
Well, I mean,
because of his versatility.
Long-term team building perspective, I don't know, maybe, but that's not really my focus, right? What I want to know is in this next game, what can we expect from this team, right? In this season. And I think in the short term, Jahmyr Gibbs is potentially a massive weapon for this offense based on the way Ben Johnson has designed this offense. And I think that they knew that when they grabbed him. They were excited. They were so excited in that draft room because they know what they're capable of doing with his versatility in the backfield. And so that's what I'm excited to see.
Well, I mean, his versatility. I mean, Swift is also very versatile too, right?
Yeah, and Swift was important.
Yeah. So, I mean, is Gibbs? Do you anticipate Gibbs getting that many snaps to really make an impact in this game?
I think so. I mean, I don't know for sure. Like, I don't watch college football. I'm not a college football scout, so what I understand about players is based on watching highlights and hearing, other people, smart people that watch college football talk about them. I also, I don't know for sure, like David Montgomery is a fine running back, a guy that I've always been, happy with. I don't think that running backs ultimately make a huge difference in win probability, but I think with this offensive line and then two decent running backs, I think they can really control the line of scrimmage and everything kind of flows from there, right? We've seen Jared Goff be successful when the run game is successful. And so I think the Lions offense, whether it's Montgomery or Gibbs, or I think both at times, I think this Lions offense is going to be successful with Jared Goff.
All right. So you like Lions +7 at Kansas City to open the NFL season on Thursday night. Does your model have a number for this, or does that come along later in the season?
Yeah, my model in the early weeks of the season is not as accurate. So I think a lot of bettors perform well early in the year and then maybe less down the stretch as the market becomes more efficient. But because my model's concept is I want to exploit, the inefficiencies in the numbers that create the market, I've actually historically performed much better later in the season than early in the season. So I don't put as much stock into my model in the first 3 or so weeks of the season. My numbers say Kansas City -9 actually. And I'm still betting the Lions. So that's a little bit, there are reasons for that I can't really get into, but it comes down to who the teams are.
Interesting. I'm pretty sure my numbers have Kansas City by 8.5, something like that. So very similar to what you have. I'm not surprised that, your betting would be better later in the season simply because of your process, right? Looking at every snap of every game. And, I think things tend to be more predictive in season than, trying to make a projection from what happened last season to what's going to go on in week 1.
Definitely. And what I noticed last year from studying my results was that in almost every instance, my initial adjustments to teams were not enough. I didn't react quickly enough early in the season. And a lot of people have this mantra of like, well, don't overreact to early season results. Like things happen that are fluky. But my approach is designed to capture that. And so the example that I'm going to use is in week 1 last year, the Niners were favored by, I think, 7 over the Bears. And my model, projected about that gap, like the 49ers to be much better than the Bears. And the Bears won outright, I think by 9, and my grades on that game matched my pregame predictions exactly on both sides, right? So in my mind, the 49ers outplayed the Bears to the equivalent of about 7 points. Even though the results said the other way. So in that case, I didn't respond to that game because the result was not indicative of what actually happened on the field probabilistically. And then on the other side, the Packers-Bears game, or Packers-Vikings game, I bet on the Packers that game, lost. They were, they got embarrassed by the Vikings. And that was actually legitimately a bad performance by the Packers and a good performance by the Vikings. So I needed to adjust those teams after 1 week of data. And doing so would have, caught me on quicker to the idea that the Packers weren't as good as I thought they would be, and the Vikings were better than I thought they would be.
Yeah, for sure. The Chicago San Francisco game you talked about, I believe, was played in a monsoon. So does that make you more likely to kind of dismiss any of those results, especially since it kind of agreed with what your model said before the start of the season?
Yeah. one of the things that my model does is contextualize the team's goals, right? So when the weather conditions impact what a team is able to do, or like players fumble the ball because the ball is wet, like I don't take that as very predictive of future fumbles, right? And so I think when I'm grading, I'm looking context based. How did this team perform on offense and defense? And taking all of the different contextual factors in. Weather is one of them. Goals is another thing, right? So like if you're up by 3 with 6 minutes left and you have the ball on your own 20, like you may have a drive full of marginally positive EPA plays, but if you run the clock out and end the game, like that could have been one of your best drives of the entire season, situationally. So I'm taking things like that and grading it holistically. So the weather is not a specific factor in like, oh, I'm throwing this game out. It's a factor in how I produce my numbers for that game, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and it's probably like a case by case basis, right? I mean, the something may come up week 1 that you've never seen before, and you probably have to, make some subjective adjustments about what you saw based on the context, based on injuries or whatnot, right?
Exactly. And that's kind of what I think is a strength of my system, is that it's adaptable. And you cannot possibly predict the variance that is about to happen in this NFL season. But what you can do is kind of like the anti-fragile concept, is build a system that benefits from that variance and reacts to it appropriately and gets better. And that's why I think my performance has been better down the stretch in each of the last 2 seasons than it was early in the year.
Right. Yeah, so that's it. The anti-fragile, like, kind of take advantage of variances is pretty interesting. You are actually, well, I think your take is that Green Bay is very there's a high variance of outcomes for Green Bay this year. Pretty strong defense, but honestly, no one knows what we're going to get from Jordan Love at all at the quarterback position. So I think you had some positive bets on Green Bay, if I remember from your stuff on 4 for 4. Is that kind of an example of this anti-fragileness that you're talking about?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's a different way of applying it because my preseason bets aren't going to impact my week-to-week evaluations and bets, and my primary focus is on those week-to-week spread bets, right? I do futures because it's fun, and I have all these opinions, and I'm spending all this time studying the NFL, so I want to make those bets. But it applies it in a different way in the sense that you're exactly right. Jordan Love presents a variable that has a wide range of outcomes because he was a high draft pick. He has had years to develop his game under one of the best. We've seen this pattern before lead to good quarterback play in the past. And if he does step up, their schedule is so like the teams they face this year are all so mediocre. Like it's not a high variance schedule. And so if they are, 3 or 4 points better than we think they're going to be on average, then this is a 10, 11, 12 win team. And so they can make a run in the NFC because the NFC is wide open. So I do think there are some fat tail outcomes to the upside with this Packers.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I'm not buying Jordan Love. I definitely acknowledge that there's a large range of outcomes for the Packers. I'm personally not buying the upside. I kind of think the median performance for him is going to be below NFL average, and that's even in the Matt LaFleur system, I'm just not sure that gets it done. So
yeah,
I would. Yeah, go ahead.
Our uncertainty around quarterbacks in particular is I think a variable to exploit using high and low leverage bets, right? So we don't really know who Jordan Love is. We don't really know who Desmond Ridder is. We know quite a little bit about Kenny Pickett. We don't know who Sam Howell is. Obviously, with I think 3 starting rookie quarterbacks this year, like there's a lot of uncertainty. And it's one thing to make bets on in the preseason about what the range of outcomes might be, which I think is fun and good. But the more important thing is there's going to be a lot of data to react to quickly this season, especially if all those rookies are starting. And so my goal is not to tie myself to preseason projections of these teams. I want to be fluid and I want to be able to react without worrying about what my future's exposure might be. So I'm definitely not focused on the futures approach. I'm definitely focused on the reacting to what I see approach.
For sure. And you're going to be more likely to react to something you see in Bryce Young than, say, if Patrick Mahomes has a bad game week 1, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's, each team has a different profile of variance on each side of the ball for sure.
Excellent. Do you only bet NFL spreads? Like, do you bet totals or props or anything? And if so, why?
I will dabble for fun in some totals. I don't have a totals model. My approach does not capture totals in the same way that it does, offensive defensive performance. That said, if I see an advantage on both sides of the ball for an offense and I don't have any pace of play concerns, then sometimes I will hit the over and vice versa for the under. But no, my singular focus is on NFL spreads. Like I want to build the best NFL model for beating NFL spreads that exists. And I don't have time to do all the stuff for props. And then also, I want access to as many outs as possible. And frankly, if you're betting props, you're more likely to get limited than if you're betting strictly NFL sides. And so I've found that I've been able to get more money down in more places for longer because I'm not exploiting easy to beat markets. I'm entirely focused on extremely difficult markets. And I think that gives me a little bit of leeway.
For sure. So is that? I mean, it's because it's hard and because you can get more money down. That's the primary driver.
It's that, and I think that it requires intense focus to be good at it. Like I just don't think that anyone, I see these people and they're betting like 6 different sports and they're originating 6 different sports, and all power to them. Like I don't know their process. I can't speak to it, but I just can't understand how someone can possibly originate successfully in 6 liquid markets that have completely different, approaches, right? So I'm entirely focused on one market because I think that's what it's going to take to be good enough to beat late week NFL spreads. And it also takes years and years of, experience, learning, growth, adjustments. So I think just recognizing the difficulty of the problem is limiting my, volume of bets.
Right. So, SharpClarke, how about a surprise prediction for the 2023 NFL season?
I'm going to go with Chargers to win the Super Bowl. I am a big fan of Justin Herbert. I think that their injuries last year were okay. So here's another comment on player level evaluation. Sometimes we sort of stack up player evaluations and say, well, this right tackle is worth this many points. The center is worth this many points. The left guard is worth this many points. And so here's the difference. But, cluster injuries at things like offensive line and secondary and receiver are they're exponential impact, right? So like your wide receiver 1 goes down, your wide receiver 2 goes down. Now you've got a wide receiver 3 playing wide receiver 1. You're impacting 3 or 4 starting positions all at the same time in a crucial element of the game, which is the passing offense. And same thing with offensive line, right? Like how are you going to help Chip when you've got 3 backups on the line? So I think that happened last year for the Chargers on both sides of the ball. And I think for that reason, they're a little bit underrated. And I think they have what it takes to emerge from a very difficult AFC.
Interesting. Obviously, the Chargers agree with you on Justin Herbert. They just gave him a huge new contract. I think that came out this morning. What else do you see in that team that gives you the confidence that they can overcome the Kansas Cities and Cincinnati's of the world?
I don't think that it's likely. You asked for a surprise prediction, right? I mean, the Chiefs should be favorites in every game they play. I don't know when the next time the Chiefs are going to be underdogs is going to be. But the thing is, they have the quarterback and they have a new offensive coordinator who we don't know exactly what Kellen Moore is going to do with this offense, but the possibility that marriage is productive, especially with now a key third wide receiver in Quentin Johnson, means they have the passing offense that it takes to succeed in today's NFL. And then defensively, they, when all those guys are healthy, Joey Bosa, et cetera, they can get pressure on the quarterback. And if they're Brandon Staley is a great defensive schemer, at least has been in the past. He's struggled a little bit in the last few years with the Chargers, but we know what he's capable of. We saw it against Tua last year. So I think if the defense clicks under Staley and the offense clicks under Kellen Moore, I just think that they have the types of things that are likely to lead to success in those high leverage moments. And so it's kind of like another one of those tail outcomes, right? Like a team like the Ravens, I just don't think that they have the type of offensive style that really leads to Super Bowl success. Whereas I think the Chargers do have that potential if things click.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, I feel like the Chargers are one of those teams that every year they're just having a key guy go down in the secondary. a little bit like San Francisco, although I feel like San Francisco's results have been a lot better over the past couple years. Maybe that's just because of the two coordinators that they've had that have gone on to be, NFL head coaches. But is that right? Like the Chargers keep getting dinged up on defense, and like Bosa didn't play a full season last year as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, injuries happen, and like I don't have any data on whether or not injuries are more likely to be hitting the same teams at a higher rate than different teams. I currently treat them as random. Like I have no reason to believe that the Chargers are particularly susceptible to injury. Maybe there's some,
Right.
Maybe the way the trainers work or something, impacts that. I don't know. It's not something that I really consider. I consider injuries to be pretty much luck. So if the Chargers stay healthy for the first time in years, then I think they have that upside.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's completely reasonable to treat injuries as luck. I was just looking at how healthy the New York Jets defense was last year, which was certainly a big factor in, I think the hype that is going on this year for the New York Jets, which I'm not really a believer in either. But yeah, I think that's random. I think the Jets have more injuries, and they're just not going to be the same defense as last year.
Yeah,
All right.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right, SharpClarke, I really wanted to talk to you about a paper that you posted on Twitter. It was an academic paper about building successful betting models. I actually, based on my academic background, I kind of have an aversion to any academic paper because I think the vast majority of them are completely worthless in a practical setting. But somehow you dug up this one that seems to be quite practical. So tell us about the paper and what it says about model building.
Yeah, so this is what I really wanted to talk about today. The basic contention of the paper and from my reflections following it is that a successful betting model has two different ways that you can improve its profitability. The first is by predicting outcomes with more accuracy, right? The better your model is at predicting outcomes, the more profitable it's going to be. But the second is the more decorrelated from market you can be, the more profitable it's going to be. And that's because when you're decorrelated from market, when your predictions are off from the true probability and the market's predictions are off from the true probability, you're more likely to be in the direction of the true probability from the market. And thus you're making plus EV bets. There are fewer outcomes where you are on the same side as the market and further away and further off because you're using completely different inputs and a completely different methodology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like, yeah, no, I mean, the decorrelation is like the key idea, right? And I thought you brought it up really well when you're talking about model building, right? And this is something that my friend Mike Craig asked me one of the first times that I ever met him. So he said, do you build your model to be more accurate or do you build your model to find value? And I think that's the same concept of what they're getting at with this paper, right? They are saying you don't necessarily need to build something that's more accurate. And by the way, that's actually what I've spent the last decade doing. Try to build a model that's more accurate, that is as accurate as possible, and believing that is, well, actually, I believe that is a useful thing to do. But the other approach is to say, let's build a model that finds value. And I think this paper says, well, you do that by actually purposely decorrelating your model with what the market says. And does that sound right from your reading as well?
Yeah, exactly. And so you have to think of it like it's a different way of thinking about the problem, right? So if your model is decorrelated and you have an off-market projection, there's a good chance that the market is right and you're wrong. But if that's the case, then you're betting into a 50% probability, and you're basically just losing the VIG in the long run, right? But if the market's wrong away from true probability and you're decorrelated, you're more likely to be either on the true probability or on the other side of it. In which case now, sorry,
just real quick, just because you're closer because the market's further off, right? Is that kind of the way to think about that?
So you might be equally off, right? So let's say the true probability is 50% and the market is giving it's giving the home team 52%. And you're giving the home team 48%, right? So you're equally off the true probability as the market. You're not more accurate. But when you make that bet, you are betting, accounting for VIG. Obviously, you have to overcome VIG, but you're 2% closer, right? You're making an EV bet if you can get under 2% VIG when combined with line shopping.
Right. I mean, again, and like some of the language they use in the paper is very reminiscent of The Logic of Sports Betting, the book by Ed Miller and Matthew Davidow, right? Like your advantage is that you don't have to bet everything. The market has to be accurate on everything. You don't. You just need to find a few of those bets where they're off, right? And this decorrelation process, and they actually show an example in the paper, is the suggestion about how to get there. And I think the example is really interesting because they look at NBA spreads and they try to beat NBA spreads, and I don't really understand. I don't really understand their metrics about how they evaluated it. I presume it's good when it's positive, but what was interesting was the inputs, right? If you wanted to do an NBA model, you should probably like hack through all the play-by-play and understand player absences, yada yada yada. But what they were doing was actually taking like box scores of players from before that game, which is clearly kind of an inferior data set, right?
Right.
And I think, like from my perspective, like it's, the decorrelation, like you can purposely decorrelate stuff by looking at particular metrics that maybe the market isn't emphasizing enough. That's kind of what I got out of it, or that's kind of how I plan to use it in the future.
Yeah,
Does that make sense? Or
yeah, totally. And I agree with you at the outset. Academic papers are rarely practical. It's the concepts, right? And I've been thinking a lot recently about how shifting your paradigm can really open up new ways of thinking about problems. And so like, I'm not supporting this model. I'm not saying it's useful. What I found interesting was that the decorrelation principle only worked to a certain extent, right? Once they decorrelated by, I think it was like 60 or 80%, their accuracy had dropped off by such a drastic amount that they were no longer profitable. So the key is to decorrelate to the extent that you can still be predictive. And that's why I do what I do, which is, my metrics have outperformed, EPA per play, success rate, DVOA at predicting future performance over the last few years. And models are much more sophisticated than using those metrics, obviously. But the idea is that if I can build a predictive system that is accurate, at least, close to the same accuracy level as the models that are influencing the market, but using completely different metrics and thinking about performance in a completely different way, then the biases that my model captures are going to be different from the biases that the market is capturing. And that's what creates the decorrelation that I think can lead to more betting opportunities where you're getting plus EV.
Right. And I would also say that the paper suggests that like your new model, your new metrics, I don't think they even have to be as accurate as the market. Like,
yeah, exactly. You don't have to be accurate.
2% less. I don't know what the threshold is. Whatever. I mean, it can be 2, 3. I mean, I usually measure this stuff based on root mean squared error, but it could you don't want to be 20% less accurate than the market. That seems far-fetched that's going to actually find value. But
so what I've discovered in my own, work on this since then is that the key variable that determines how much less accurate you can be is how efficient the market is. So take one extreme. If the market prediction is perfectly accurate every single time, then you'll never create an edge by decorrelating. And that's pretty obvious, right? But if that's the case, then there's no point in ever betting to make money, into whatever market we're talking about. It's literally impossible.
Right.
On the other hand, if the market's variance is like 20% in either direction, like a flat, it could be anywhere from 20% off in one direction to 20% off in the other direction at a completely flat rate, which is also a ridiculous notion, then you really don't even have to be accurate. You just have to be decorrelated, right? But in reality, the market is, like I said, it's going to be a bell curve. And the width of that bell curve is going to determine how accurate your model has to be in order to be profitable. So the wider the bell curve, the more decorrelation is important. The tighter the bell curve, the more accuracy is important. So it's a complicated, mathematical system, but those are the two elements.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I've been looking at baseball strikeout props lately, and my general conclusion is the market is not very strong. And part of my conclusion is that there's some really simple things that you can do, like not very sophisticated models that I think are pretty useful in betting against the strikeout prop market. And I think that's an example of that, right? Like if you try to do the same thing for like baseball money lines, which a lot of my really good friends think is like maybe even harder to beat than the NFL spreads, you're going to have a reasonably accurate model. And like, I personally don't have time to build that, nor the motivation to build that. But if all I have to do in like a strikeout prop market is like, look at some Zips projections, estimate, the number of innings that starter is going to go. Like, I mean, it's literally, it's not the hardest thing at all. Maybe adjust a little bit for who the opponent team is. So that market is not like that model, like that simple thing is not going to beat the market. But I think in some sense, it's a little bit decorrelated from the market, and it doesn't have to be that accurate. And I'm not saying that I'm a great baseball strikeout prop better. I actually don't think I am. I'm just kind of exploring it right now. But from what I've done over the last 3 weeks, I think it's kind of an example of what you're saying, right? So like the weaker the market, the less good your model has to be. And I guess that makes sense just intuitively, right?
Yeah. And I should say one of the reasons, other than being a big football fan and just, trying to understand the game better, one of the things that attracts me to NFL spreads is that there's no way the market can actually be super predictive in NFL spreads because the number of variables in NFL games is so large and the number of data points of games played is so small, right? I mean, each team plays such a limited amount of games and every game has so many elements of context that any sort of machine learning model or back-tested data-based model is going to contain so many flaws that you have to account for. And I think that's a unique element to the NFL. And then when you combine that with the fact that it's one of the most liquid markets in terms of NFL spreads, then you have, an efficient market built on inefficient predictions. And that's, I think, what I'm trying to exploit. Is it's definitely not going to be as easy as, as a smaller market where there are fewer participants and less sophistication. But I do think that if you can capture the biases within the results-based models, I do think that there is an edge to be captured by being decorrelated from those inputs.
Yeah, absolutely. And just coming back to your model, right? We talked about how you watch every snap, you build that into your own metrics. I presume you believe there's decorrelation there.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So,
right.
Yeah. And it's not like, okay, so if I was, there's two approaches to handle market bias, right? The most obvious one, I think the one that 99.9% of bettors think of is how can I identify the biases within the market and then exploit them? And so this might be like, oh, well, the market hasn't accounted for how the moving back of the extra point has impacted the relevant, the relative number of 8-point games versus 7-point games. So whenever there's this spread, I'm going to bet this, whatever. Those types of biases that you can identify, you might be able to capture for a limited amount of time, but eventually the market will catch up to those biases and account for them in the market. That's what we mean by market efficiency. Mm-hmm. So instead of trying to identify the biases in the market, I start from a completely different place and I just ignore the way the market participants come up with their predictions. I'm using a different way of thinking about the game. And so I just hope to capture different biases than the market. I'm not trying to identify them. I'm just trying to just avoid them, basically. And there's no way I can be 100% decorrelated from the market, but I'm going to end up with some decorrelation just by virtue of taking a different approach.
Exactly. And I think that's a little bit right. So like the idea of building a model that's as accurate as possible, you shouldn't exactly throw that out the window, especially when you're trying to combat something as difficult as NFL spreads. And I think that's part of the reason why my model has done pretty well. I think it is a little bit different from what other things. I mean, I think there's such, a lot of the stuff is actually, I mean, this is a complete guess, but from what I see out there, a lot of stuff is driven by EPA that you can pull out of, the NFL Fast Start play-by-play. And I think a lot of people still use DVOA. And I don't use either of those. So I think that's part of, and I have, striven, I've strived to make that model as accurate as possible. So obviously a lot different from what you're doing, but I think the general approach is similar and now actually has some academic backing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, and I don't know what all the different market participants are using. I can only guess, right? People aren't going to give it away.
Yeah, well, I just gave my guess. So everyone can feel free to laugh at me about how bad that guess is.
Yeah. And I think another important point, I know we're going long, but like,
no, keep going.
There's a lot of criticism when, this guy recently on Twitter, young guy posted his win total projection model, and it was like 49ers are going to win 6.5 games and Jaguars are going to come last in their division, and absurd predictions, right? I don't know what his model is proprietary and he won't give anything away, but the idea that like, wow, this guy's so wrong, he's going to lose all his money is a little bit absurd, because let's say the market is efficient and the Niners are going to win on average 10.5 games. Or assume it was minus 110 VIG, which is not, but let's say it is. Then he's going to lose that, roughly 50% of the time, and he's going to lose 2.5% on VIG. Just like anyone that predicts the Niners are going to win 10 games and bets the under, right? Like, it doesn't really matter how far off your bet is, unless you're Kelly staking, which you should not be if you have a decorrelated market, which is a whole nother topic. But if your stakes are somewhat consistent, like, it doesn't really matter how far off market you are. You just have to be directionally correct.
Yeah. And I believe that is the key. All right, SharpClarke, let's end with a couple potentially non-sports questions. What's your favorite book?
Jitterbug Perfume by Tom Robbins. It's a novel about an ancient king who tries to defy dying, basically, and ends up living for thousands of years. It's a good book.
Is he like miserable for those thousands of years, or
no? He's living his life, and it's he just has a spirit of defiance of like. It's a novel, so this is all sort of me drawing from the novel. But I think the spirit is the rules of life say you have to die, and he just rejects that rule. And that's kind of how I live my life. Is like, there are all these rules that people put on you, or ways of thinking that you have to adopt. And I say no, like, I'm going to do things my way. I don't care what the data says. I'm just going to go.
Right. And so, and this book certainly suggests that leads to ultimate happiness and longevity. All right, maybe not.
No, I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but it's more so just there's just not one way of doing things. Like, you don't have to let people dictate how you live your life.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
awesome. How about your best culinary experience?
I don't have a long-term memory, which is great because I always experience things in the moment. But most recently, in Vegas, I went to Sushi Samba, which is a Japanese Brazilian fusion restaurant. I think it was at the Venetian, and it was delicious. I love Japanese food and I love Brazilian food, and this is the first time that I've seen those two blended. And the sashimi was so good.
Oh, so I'm about to go to Vegas soon. What would you would recommend the sashimi?
Yes, they have a lot of stuff, but the best was the sashimi plates that they make, like hamachi with all the kind of like lemon and olive oil and whatever else they put on there. The flavor combinations were just exquisite.
So what makes it Brazilian is the sauce or whatever they put on top of the sashimi. Is that right?
Well, they also had a lot of meat offerings. So we had some of those too, like steak and stuff. So there was like combination of meat and fish, basically.
Okay. But like the sashimi isn't necessarily Brazilian.
No, the sashimi was very Japanese. There were some more hybrid dishes. I can't remember specifically, but the sashimi is what I remember most.
Interesting. Awesome. Last question. If you could have dinner with any one person, dead or alive, who would it be?
Daniele Bellelli. He is a living Italian immigrant to America. He was a professor for a while of comparative religion. He's written several books, and he hosts the Drunken Taoist podcast. He's just a person that, like, not only has he's shaped the way that I think quite dramatically through his podcast mostly, but also his books. But he's also a person that I just think being around, he has that sense of like life, right? Like he wants to every moment of life to be full. And like, he does martial arts and he does like philosophy, and he's just such an interesting guy that I would just listen to him talk for an hour.
That is so cool. He's a professor of comparative literature still?
I think he used to be comparative religion, actually.
Comparative religion. Okay.
I think he used to be. I'm not sure that he still is now. I know he has podcasts now. And yeah, he's on Twitter. He's just a really smart guy. I've been finding a lot of value in the opinions of immigrants in particular. I'm actually an immigrant myself. I moved here when I was 14. And I think that having access to diversity at a young age and experiencing things from different paradigms can really open up ways of thinking about the world that I find interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Where did you emigrate from?
Well, I was from England via Dubai for 3 years.
Okay. Awesome. And so do you recommend this? I presume you recommend this Drunken Taoist podcast as well?
Yeah, Drunken Taoist. He's got tons of episodes back there. So just find a topic you're interested in and just give it a listen. He's very, very interesting guy. He's got a cool accent too.
I presume he makes a living from podcasting, or is like former professor making a living doing media.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if he's written books as well. So like it's probably a combination of things. I don't know if he's still an active professor, but I know that he was recently. So
awesome. SharpClarke, thank you so much for your time today. Please let everyone know where they can find your work.
Yeah, at SharpClarke NFL on Twitter. Do not go to Threads because Threads is not going to take over Twitter. But I do have one on there just in case. 4for4.com is the website where I write all my NFL analysis if you're interested. And you can also sign up for my mailing list on my website, sharpclarke.com.
Awesome. And if people want to tail your bets, that's just for the 4for4 subscription service?
Exactly. Yep.
Awesome. And are you're just a contributor there, trying to build up like their betting side of things? Is that there?
Yeah, I find value in putting myself out there publicly and tracking everything publicly because it really puts the pressure on. Like nothing, exposing yourself in that way, I think really makes you think critically about your process. And so I've been doing that for the last couple of years. And I find value in the community as well, just going back and forth with people about my process and what I see.
Absolutely. Yeah. You definitely follow SharpClarke's Twitter for lots of engagement, shall we say. Lots of good run-ins with pretty famous NFL bettor out in Vegas. Lots of good stuff there. Did you mention the 4for4 podcast that you're on? Are you on that every week?
So every week it's called Move the Line. Connor Allen, Ryan Noonan, and I, and we're going to do it through the season. Right now we're doing divisional previews, but we're going to go through, and each week we'll talk about a game or two each that we like or what we're seeing. And it's there's a lot of content out there, right? And I try to present things in a slightly different way, like talking about the Lions today. It's like it's not so much this team is better than people think or this team is worse. It's more so like, what is it about this matchup in particular that might skew the results in one direction or the other?
Yeah, no, I've been listening to a couple episodes. I think it's really good. You guys do a really good job. Connor is someone that I think I've been following since last year when he posted a lot of analysis of NFL season-long props. Yeah, definitely. Move the Line podcast. SharpClarke, thanks again for your time.
My name is Ed Fang. I'm honored to be your host for the Football Analytics Show. I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with SharpClarke. Please give him a follow on Twitter. He's got a lot of interesting things going on, and I think we all have a lot to learn from him. Just a reminder, you can get my free sports betting email newsletter. Go to thepowerrank.com. Once again, my name is Ed Fang, your host for the Football Analytics Show. I will talk to you again soon.